and all right, here we go. There's two different objectives we have for this session today. And first is to introduce you to some of the types of things that we're doing in the data-driven storytelling work. And then after I do that, I've got some really quick introductions to what people are doing with the knowledge. So basically stories about stories that are being told in organizations and how this work is being used. And after I go over those short examples, Sheri has been kind enough to join us today, and she's going to take a deep dive into the work that she's been doing with data-driven storytelling at General Motors. So Sheri, really happy to have you with us today. Right, if you think about kind of what's the content or the domain of data-driven storytelling, there's really three big buckets of work. And the first one is something that I know a lot of our contacts in HR have been working on for many years, and that's simply getting the data. We hear a lot about, the work that it takes just to make sure the data is accurate. I've heard story after story about large global companies really being challenged with just knowing how many employees they have, and that's because the data is coming in from lots of different places. We really don't do that type of work in the data-driven storytelling content. So even though this is important and you need data and we understand the struggles, that is not the emphasis of what we're doing. Certainly we need data to be able to tell a story, but that process is one that's, we kind of look at it as behind the scenes. One thing we do want to point out, though, is that, often we get focused on the big data that we're trying to house and store, but there's also lots of different types of small, and I'll call it medium-sized data, that also can be very useful for storytelling. And that can come from qualitative sources also, like focus groups, or some people are using blogs and chats. So there's lots of different types of data available for us. And maybe that's part of the challenge, because with the inundation of lots of data, then the challenge really becomes how do you focus your data to tell a story, because it's impossible to tell a story with too much data. So what we really get interested in the topic and what we teach is how do I focus the data to be able to tell a story that's going to lead to action, and action that's going to help the business to achieve its goals. So the course and the tools that we use are on focusing data, thinking about different lenses to use to tell your story when you have it, and then going into the types of options for telling the story. Not just presentations, but how do you craft a story? How do you come up with a beginning, middle, and end that's compelling, and how do you frame it? And why is this important? One of the things that we've heard from all of our stakeholders over the last few years leads to that point number one about having big data. We've been challenged with data. I think a lot of organizations have done really good work in pulling the data together into dashboards, for example. But after years and years of working with their data, making sure it's accurate and putting it into a dashboard, what we're seeing is that that is really not the magic. So it's a bit of a disappointment for some organizations, because we have all the data, but no one's really using it. And if you're not using it, if you're not paying attention to it, then no one's going to take action. So the key that we saw was that something was missing. So the data's there, but there's no action, and what can you do in between to make things better? And that's when we started thinking about the data-driven storytelling work, which started about 6 years ago. And I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble moving these slides also.
Theresa, if you'd like, I can just take control of it, and then you can just let me know when to move them.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Okay.
I appreciate that. Sorry, all. There seems to be a little technology glitch today. So you can move it forward. Yes. So lots of data. We want to take action, and the question is, how do we do that? Is it by giving people more and more data? The answer was definitely no. What's important is that we frame the data in a story, because stories allow us to evoke emotion. The discipline of narrative is something that's been used quite a bit in terms of helping organizations frame their culture and communicating, but we can also use it for data. And again, the key here is that we transform the data from numbers and bar charts and pie charts and dashboards to something that someone will remember, and something that, again, evokes an emotion. That's the important key. And now we're at a point where we have a tremendous amount of research backing that up. If you want to go to the next slide. For example, a lot of this work has been done in the medical field and done before we started doing it in business. This is just an example of one project where doctors were using medical research to initially try to help nurses change how they were taking care of jaundiced babies. So in version 1 of the training, where they communicated all of the facts via data, which was very compelling, no one took action. No one changed their behavior, because picture yourself in a room when somebody's just giving you lots and lots of numbers. You might some of them sink in, some don't. But if it doesn't affect you in a way that makes you remember, it's unlikely you're going to take action. And that's what the medical doctor saw. So their round 2 of training involved using pictures. And pictures are very powerful in evoking emotions. So you see this picture of a baby being treated for jaundice, and when that picture was up and they told a story about what a difference nurses could make, those 2 things helped frame the points they wanted to make, and led to changes in behavior and action, which then led to better results with the babies and the treatments that they wanted. You can go to the next slide. Now, and another thing I mentioned, that there's science. There's a lot of neuroscience research now showing what happens when different stimulus is exposed to someone, what happens to their brain. So we can put people in MRI machines, we can take blood samples, and basically what we're learning that if you put a lot of numbers in front of someone, it hasn't hurt anyone yet, but basically nothing happens. So the synapses in the brain that are supposed to be going on and off, they don't do anything with numbers. Whereas if you tell a story, the opposite happens. You see the brain start working. And there are some studies that we look at that show you can have a significant effect on changing people's behavior based on the type of stories that you tell. I have on the slide this book by David Rock, and I don't know if any of you have read his work, but I would highly recommend it. He basically translates a lot of the very scientific work in a very user-friendly way. And there's one particular quote that he uses that I love when I'm thinking about communicating data. And his point is that if you have too much data, it's like hundreds of actors jumping on and off the stage. So if you've ever been in that position where you're presenting data and you're wondering why no one paid attention, well, they probably were all paying attention to something different. And by not focusing and having a story that everybody shares, you run the risk of everybody walking away with a different impression of what the topic was and leading to inaction. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the model that we use to try to put all this together uses 4 different terms, and we talk about data, dialogue, action, results. And the storytelling piece really comes into the dialogue. There are numerous examples I've seen of managers getting data and jumping to action, and when we do the measurement work, we see that data to action to result has much lower results than when you engage people in dialogue, because in 95% of the cases, the actions needed are not just from the manager. So having a dialogue, telling a story is very important if you want the work you're doing to lead to measurable business results in your organization. And the storytelling helps you get a really strong effect, and much stronger than it would be with just doing the data. All right, if we go to the next slide. You might wonder, well, what gets in the way? Storytelling sounds, should be easy. We can learn it, we can do it. One of the things that we've learned in doing this work for the last 6+ years is that one of the barriers, or one of the things that gets in the way, is often us. So particularly in the HR field, one of the things we've seen is that there seems to be a lack of, I want to say, confidence in really coming up with a point of view on your data. So, I mean, I've had people tell me in groups that they think it's unethical to come up with one point of view in the data, that their job as an HR professional is to gather all the data, put it in a form so you can present all the different data to the senior executives and managers, and then it's the managers or the executive's job to figure out what the story is. Because if the HR executive or representative goes to the data and finds out what they think the story is, it's like cheating and just using the data you want. Now, this has been a really controversial issue, which is why I bring it up in this introductory webinar, because if we can't have a point of view, you can't tell a story. We need a point of view. And in fact, one of my points of view is that the executives in the company are paying the analytics departments and professionals to have a point of view. That's what we want to do. So getting over this problem is really important, and it's critical if you want to build a workforce, an HR team, or even any other disciplines that are going to tell stories, because you can't tell a story without one point of view. The story has a beginning, middle, and end, and that's and again, it can't come from 4,000 different points of view or even 100 perspectives in a big data set. All right, we can move to the next one. Now, the way that we've pulled this together then is, one is really presenting a position that we need a point of view, and then looking at examples from other disciplines where they use a point of view and they focus their work to tell a story. And one is in the area of making movies. Now, granted, maybe I'm influenced from Los Angeles, but this is a field of work that has tools and discipline and has really moved forward dramatically. So if we can think like a director with our data, you're kind of on the right track here. And you can think about all the different ways that you can tell the same story, and that concept is about data genre. And we've brought 3 types of data genre to the data-driven storytelling work. Okay, go to the next slide. There's multiple types of genre. So we can certainly add in others. In fact, I'm sure the comedy would work somewhere. We haven't quite done that yet, but these 3 we've been able to use and then create some discipline around what does it look like when you're laying out a dashboard using this kind of thinking, or laying out a PowerPoint, or putting together a report. You would think about the way you present your data differently. So one is the documentary, just the facts. And the documentary is probably used more than you might think. There are many cases where the HR data we have, or any other kind of data, it's just really not all that interesting. It's a bit of preventive maintenance. So I see this a lot with dashboards. People look at the dashboard and say, tell me a great story, and I think there's just not one here, but it's okay if we have, just the facts and it's preventive maintenance. Now, if you have a documentary, let's go back to the idea of emotion. You don't want to get people emotionally charged when you're just presenting baseline facts. So that's an important thing to remember. The second one is a drama. Now, this is used when you definitely want to change behavior and you have a good story to tell. Now, the key to creating a drama in your presentation is often bringing in some characters. So I think of a couple examples where organizations were really worried about turnover, and they put up charts and data, but it wasn't until you used the names of a couple important people who left that the audience would agree to take action. Because just looking at numbers doesn't help me, but if you tell me the story of 2 or 3 key people via the drama model, then I understand more why the data is important and what it really represents. The last genre that we work with is the horror genre. Now, you might think that, we would never use that, but I will tell you the horror genre can have very high impact and is very useful. But you got to be careful when you use it, because you can't use that one all the time. But again, there's a model behind when we do this, how we do this, how we prepare. But the idea is you want to evoke really strong emotion, because you need your team to take action. So you can probably in your own organizations think of times when this was important, and this is when it's not just the facts. It's organizing. It's getting people on board. It's thinking really carefully about when the emotion comes in, which is what we do, what directors do in movies. In fact, there's software that you can use that allows you to plot your meetings and how you present, and plot how much emotion you want when. All right, we can go to the next slide. So I know that was really brief. Again, we teach this program in anywhere from half day to 2.5 days. So I'm giving you just an overview of what it is. You know, it's not visualization. It's not trying to come up with big data. What we're trying to do is really teach individuals to find the story in their data and tell it in a compelling way so they can take action. So let me next tell you some really quick stories from some people who've done that. Okay, the first person is Kate Aiken, and it's an honor to know her. I actually met her ages ago when she was working for Oxygen in New York City, and she had a career then. She was a senior executive at the Gap and recently went to McKesson. And Kate's team has gone through the data-driven storytelling work, and I think when you go through it, you learn it, and then you try to find safe places to practice. So in Kate's role, she was organizing all of the various HR department reports, end-of-the-year reports for the CHRO. Now, the CHRO also had been involved in the data-driven storytelling work, so she was pretty confident that this was something they wanted to use. So rather than have all of her HR departments do the reports the way they always did, she challenged them to have an overview of the report with a picture. Now, we use titles and pictures a lot in storytelling because the picture, just like that baby picture you saw, evokes an emotion. And she said it was challenging. It made, again, it's very different, but it worked very well. And she said the CHRO, really appreciated it because it framed the report in a way that allowed them to have a very healthy and positive and action-oriented conversation. All right, we'll go to the next one. And next, another individual who's taken this work in a really interesting direction is Paul Skinner. He's one of the key leaders in an organization called CRB Consulting Engineers. They had done their first, they'd done the first, I think, all-company survey of their employees, and they did some engagement work, traditional engagement questions along with some other custom work. And the key was, what now? So rather than just rolling it out, they took one day in their all-leader off-site meeting to do two things, to learn a little bit about storytelling as a senior management team, and then also use their data to together come up with what the company story was going to be in the data. It was an interactive, really fun experience, and they were incredibly creative in the way they modeled the story. So they were able to walk away with a presentation that all the managers were going to share with employees that was more than just bar charts and pie charts and numbers, but it really framed the conversation and helped them communicate what was, not just what the state of the company was, but, how they wanted to think about it and how they wanted to move forward. All right, we can go to the next one. And Cindy and Bob have been working on a really interesting project. First of all, I've got a little note down there, Vizier is here. So, they have taken, for their very large organization, Exelon is in the electrical utility business, and they've been, they've acquired a couple organizations. They're growing very quickly, and they have the same HR data challenge a lot of other companies have had. So over the last couple of years, they've implemented Vizier, which is what people see as the dashboard. So it's an HR analytics program. They rolled it out to 240 of their HR professionals across the organization. So everybody's got the data. They have data they've never had in their hands before. It's pretty easy to see. The visualization is very good. But they thought there was still something missing. So they added the data-driven storytelling work as what they call HR Analytics 201. So 101 was Vizier, 201 is data-driven storytelling, and they're working hard to get this to everyone. So they're doing one-day meetings across the organization, bringing the HR teams together and to make sure that they have time to practice, and they have a custom case study that they've built with the Vizier data, and we're just in the process now of working with them and seeing how this is going to roll out. But they felt like it was critical that they don't just give their employees the data, but they give their HR professionals a way to use the data to help managers take action with it. All right, and then Katie Metcalf was actually in one of our webinars, I think, last year. And I think it's really interesting, her takeaway. We've got a tool that we use called the measurement map. And it's just, again, one of the different tools we introduced to the group. And Katie took it back to Microsoft and did some root cause analysis with it. And I think Katie's on the webinar, so if she's there, she can raise her hand. I'd like to ask her to say a few words about what she's done with it and maybe how this has worked with her, since it's been a while since we've touched base.
Katie, you're unmuted. You can go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so basically after taking the course, I think it was great to have some of these tools, things like the measurement map that you see here, and also, making sure that we have good stories and a good story arc with our storytelling. Yeah, so basically we took some of these tools, combined them with some of the existing tools that we've been using, like lean root cause analysis, and taking some of our key HR metrics and looking at some of our dashboards, looking at some of our scorecards, and really trying to tell a story with what's going on. And I think that has been really great. Basically, I don't think we were doing any really great sort of storytelling, and I think that storytelling has helped with our root cause analysis, so that we really are getting at, what is the true root cause for some of the outcomes that we're seeing with our key HR metrics. So yeah, great tools.
Thanks. And we'll have some time for questions at the end. So Katie, if you're still on the line, if anybody has questions for you, we might come back to you later.
No problem.
Thanks. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Right, well, now we want to, again, those were just some really short stories, so mini stories. And what I want to do now is turn it over to Sheri, who's been working with, I've got to say, big data, giant data. General Motors is a large organization with lots of data, and she's been in the middle of trying to help the organization really use it to make a difference. So Sheri, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Theresa. So let me see if I can advance. Okay, very good. Let me just start by giving you a little bit of information about General Motors. Hopefully all of you are familiar with this company, and this infographic here just gives you a little idea of how expansive we are. So when you talk about big data, we've got big data here, so especially in HR. So as you can see, we're a global manufacturing company operating in 31 different countries at over 170 different locations. We have 190,000 employees globally, and we are proud to say that we have produced our 5 millionth vehicle this year, so that was a pretty exciting event for us. So trying to get a handle on workforce analytics for a population that size can be a challenge, and it is very important to be data-driven in how we think about our workforce. So let me just move on and talk to you a bit about our journey into talent analytics at GM. So we've been involved with a lot of HR planning activities for a very long time. So headcount planning, using that information to drive budgets and stuff like that. But the true analytics really got a serious start in 2012. And we started with one person, which is me. So I'm not an HR professional, I'm a statistician. And so as you can imagine, this activity of turning data into stories is a little bit out of my comfort zone, but that's why, we get a lot of help from our HR partners to help us really embellish the story or understand how to communicate it. But in any case, so this activity started within our HR planning group. It was just one person, but then in 2013, we grew into a full department, and we separated from HR planning. So the planning and the headcount and the forecasting and the budgeting is in one department, and the analytics is in a separate department. And we are a team now of 4, and we consist of these are my terms, we have a data wrangler, so someone who's very skilled at pulling together data from various different sources and manipulating it into format that is easy to do our statistical analysis. We have a modeling expert, so an individual who's very good at developing simulations and models to take advantage of our predictive capability, and then we have another statistician that does the heavy lifting with our predictive analytics. And the reason we were formed is that we recognized that we really needed to ramp up the use of data-driven decision-making in HR. So that's a natural part of the business in other areas, engineering, supply chain, purchasing, marketing, and in HR, using data to make decisions was a little bit further behind in the progression. So a lot of decisions, because it seems like, well, you know, we're talking about people here, and it's a little fuzzier when you're talking about measurement systems and things like that, but there's a tremendous amount of potential, and I think all of you are probably noticing that this is an area getting a lot of attention nowadays. There's a lot more expertise being developed in talent analytics. So that's why we were formed. And let's see. We believe that data-driven storytelling is crucial to the success of our work. So one of the things that we've learned along our journey is that analysis is not enough. So as you could see from the prior chart, we had a lot of data experts on our team, and that was not enough. Arts and charts are not enough. Showing pie charts and bar graphs, as Theresa mentioned, they may be interesting to look at, but they're not as memorable or compelling as stories are. And one of the things that really solidified that for me is that I have learned the power of stories that are not data-driven and how they take root and become urban legends. That is something that we've encountered over and over again. So a couple of people make a comment about something, and suddenly that takes off as a story describing reality. And so we're trying to balance both sides. So we know the power of the storytelling. It's hard to disrupt an urban legend, but we can't just rely on data to get us there. So we have to combine those two elements to really help the business. And that's really what this is all about. It's about helping the business, helping our leaders make better decisions, knowing what a critical part talent plays in the success of a company. I just can't stress the importance of that enough. So I want to talk to you a little bit about our evolution. So early on, when we started leveraging the data that we have about people, we had things like demographics. So here's an example of a chart that we might have produced, say, 5 years ago. And we would show, this is for a particular department, for example. We might show a bar chart of the ages of the people in that department and distinguish between people who are eligible for retirement versus those who are not, and show it in an HRM meeting, and the reaction from HR and the business leaders was, oh, that's really interesting. We see we have a lot of people, that are retirement eligible, could be leaving. Now, what if we slice that by level? What if we just looked at our management level? What does that look like? And so we'd scurry back and we would, reconstruct the bar chart for that slice of the organization. And then the reaction would be something like, I'm not really sure if that number is exactly right. Can you go back and check? Because I think there might have been some people transferring out of our department, and so I'm not sure these numbers are exactly right. And then we'd spend a lot of time validating numbers and reconciling and coming back. And there was no movement in the business. So it was all about looking at the data from different angles or trying to reconcile numbers that we had versus numbers that people thought they should be. But at the end of the day, all of that activity didn't result in action to improve the business. So we need to do something different. We also, we're hearing some comments, well, it's interesting to look at this age demographic, but, people don't always leave exactly when they become eligible for retirement. So, I can't really use that because I don't know when those people are really going to leave. I just know how many there are. So this is interesting but not that useful. So phase 2, we got really sophisticated with our analytics, and we developed a binary logistic regression analysis, a predictive model to leverage our historical experience and use that to predict what our voluntary attrition would likely look like over the next 5 years. And we had all kinds of analysis around the different factors that we could link statistically as drivers for how long people might stay after they became eligible for retirement. And they were things like, the performance of the individual, if they were a leader, if they had been on an overseas assignment, what business function they were in, what their education level was. And so it was a really sophisticated model. And we developed this formula, and, we were really proud of all of this work. So when we went out to the HR team and we told them about this fantastic statistically valid model that we came up with, and they should believe in these predictions, we wanted to tell the story of our analysis, of all the stuff we did and how we got to the end result of the best model that we could come up with. Well, as you can imagine, the receivers of that information they don't really care about our journey for how we developed this really fantastic model that they should believe in. That wasn't interesting to them, nor was it actionable. They wanted to know, well, what is this telling me? So then we started getting really clever about using visualization software, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, packages like Tableau and stuff. So we took our model and the results that were generated from our model, and we tried to use visualization techniques to help tell the story. So as you can see, we tried to show hot spots of where there might be big pockets of attrition coming up and needed to be addressed, whether it was from a geographic perspective or if it was from a functional perspective, so we'd know where does the attention really need to be focused in order to address these hot spots. But even with all this fancy statistical modeling and fancy visualization techniques, the reaction that we got as we were showing this information was kind of the same thing. Well, first of all, as Theresa was mentioning in her remarks, I think we might have been guilty of having too many actors on the stage. So we had too much information about how the clock was built, and our audience really just wanted to know what time it was. So we had too much detail in the areas that weren't important. And even with all this fancy visualization, it wasn't emotional. It didn't have an emotional response. So we still got the same types of questions. Well, this is really interesting. I wonder, have you looked at it this way, or have you looked at it that way, or what about this slice of people and that slice of people? And sure, we could, of course, slice and dice the data any way we wanted to, but again, all that drove was more questions around different ways to look at the data and not action. And in order for us to provide value to the company, we need to provide insights that drive action. So then we received some help from Theresa to really rethink the way we're trying to tell our story and utilize the data-driven storytelling techniques. So we were fortunate enough to have a full-day workshop with Theresa, and it included analytics professionals from different areas in GM. So it wasn't just the talent analytics folks. We had our R&D folks there, our marketing folks, a lot of different teams. And we went through a workshop where we had a sample set of data, and we broke up into teams, and we were asked, you know, she taught us these techniques, and we were asked to practice developing a story, you know, along with the guidelines that that she helped us with, and that drove a lot of very interesting conversation. And we started thinking about how we present data in a where we put ourselves in the user's place. So what would be emotionally compelling to me if I were looking at this data? And so what we ended up with, so I showed you where we've been with our bar charts and our heat maps and our heat grids and our fancy statistical analysis, which is still very important and still has to get done. That wasn't the problem. The problem was, how do we evoke leadership into taking action, into doing something about it? So then we had an opportunity where we were going to be meeting with a functional leader, where there were some pretty significant hot spots for predicted attrition coming in the next few years. And utilizing these data-driven techniques, we told our story in this way. So rather than showing leading with a bunch of graphs and charts and validating why it was something they should look at, we started with this visual, and we took kind of a dramatic approach. There is a retirement wave, an age wave that's coming. And so how are you going to react as a leadership group? Are you going to view this retirement wave as a tsunami that you need to be afraid of and run away and, you know, try to brace yourself and protect yourself? Or are you going to view this as an opportunity to reskill your organization, to wind down activities that you see as the business transforms? Those activities might be going away, and you want to build up in other areas. So maybe this retirement wave is actually a maverick that you can grab your surfboard and go ride it out and do the right thing for the business. And so by telling the story in that way, we accomplished a couple of things. First of all, it got people's attention, the leadership's attention. And secondly, it created a memorable icon in their heads. And we started to hear them talking in terms of, is this using the words, is this a tsunami or is this a maverick? You know, we're going to jump on this wave. We're going to ride it out. We don't need to protect ourselves. This is actually something that will be helpful for us in these areas. In another area, yeah, we have to be afraid, so we need to start planning right now. And it actually drove the leadership to hold a 2-day strategic staffing strategy session where they were talking about all of these things that we had been trying to, you know, bring to the attention. You know, how much time do you have to prepare for this big wave that's coming? What is your strategy going to be? How are you going to develop people faster so that they can take the positions that are coming open at the higher end, at the upper levels, things like that. So it was really very productive and had a significant impact on the business. So, you know, this is just one example. I wouldn't say that we're experts by any means. If we really were to have done this even better, we probably could have come up with, a story with a beginning, middle, end, and elaborated a little bit that way. But this seems like a baby step, but it was a big step in terms of the impact on the business and the receptiveness that we got from our audience. So that is my example. I think it's time for questions, if I'm not mistaken, or?
Yes, and thanks so much for sharing that story. And I know that we'll probably get some questions from the audience, but I wanted to ask you one. Sheri, how did the rest of your team react to this? Because, again, you know, I met them, and I got to say, when we first started talking about this, they had a lot of questions on their faces because, you know, telling stories sounds kind of wussy and not what we're meant to do.
Yeah, well, I think you know, it's out of our comfort zone. The people that participated in that session, our analytics, were data people, and we are not typically wired to think that way. So one of the very helpful bits of advice that you gave us is go find someone who's good at storytelling, and that's where we really leaned on our HR partners a lot, because we found there's a lot of that natural ability within our HR community, and so we started to partner up, and we would start to use that vernacular and say, okay, I've got this data here, and I need your assistance as a storyteller. Let's work together and come up with a way to package this analysis in a way that tells a story as impactful, memorable. You know, that was one of the biggies. People remember the icon of the tsunami wave and the Maverick wave more than they do the heat map of the hot spots.
Yeah, and I liked your comment earlier that stories are going to happen anyway, so it's better to have a story that's data-driven than not data-driven and then taking root in the organization.
Right, and that's just a testament to how sticky stories are. You know, there's a lot of urban legends that are still floating around there, and as we start to pull the data, this isn't really true. That's somewhere somebody latched onto that story and the data don't support it. So if it's really sticky for an urban legend, it can be sticky for something that is supported by the rigorous data analysis.
Okay, and we want to open it up to questions, and I think people can type in the chat box or raise their hand. Is that what you want to do, Sheri?
Yeah, either of those are fine. So let's give people a minute to type and send or raise their hand.
So I think, Sheri, I don't know if you were involved in this, but I think that the team has used some of the storytelling work with our employee engagement project too. Is that correct?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to mention that because we did use these same concepts around engagement, and particularly around some of the patterns that we saw in the engagement data. We used that to create profiles of people and give them personas, so that, you know, there's a group of people that feel like, you know, Serious Sally, for example, and, you know, here are her attributes, and you know, there's different personas for different patterns that we saw in the data, and that's been very helpful to enable leaders to really connect with what this engagement data is telling you about your workforce. These are the different types of people that you have.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat box, and Michelle has her hand up, so whenever you want to address those.
Yeah, I don't know. So one of the questions is, how do you balance robust statistical analysis with the soft and fuzziness of storytelling? And said, may the force be with you. Thank you. That was very nice. And then I think it's along with the same one might be, what's your experience in telling storytelling with engineers? So I can take a stab at it first, Sheri, and then hand it over to you. But, you know, what I've seen is no matter who, the neurological research is just so compelling. engineers and financial people on Wall Street, that's the other group I thought is very data-driven, and accountants all have the same brains. I mean, I know we might not think that's the case, but, you know, we're all working on the same brains. And regardless of our love of data, the brain responds to story. And we've done programs with engineers and scientists, and yes, they want to know that the data behind it is robust, but they also will take actions, are more likely to take actions with the story than they are with the data. I mean, the problem with some of the really data savvy folks is that you can never get them past the charts and the data. So, because they want to know if it's correct, or did you spin it this way? I think Sheri's story was a great example. You know, you really get a lot of that. But even with them, again, what we've seen is the story works, and I think it does because it's a neurological phenomena.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think one of the big lessons that we've learned, so what we as, you know, kind of data nerdy people want to try to do is tell you the story from the beginning to the end, our story. So I started with this data, I did these manipulations, I excluded this, I included this, I came up with this chart, and then here's the analysis, where I think it's more powerful if you start with here's the story. And tell the story, and then here's why, you know, here's why I believe this is the story that the data is telling us.
Yep.
So if you start with that, you've got it, it's stuck, and then, you know, you have the analysis. That way you don't get tripped up with all the, you know, oh, well, you didn't consider this, or do you have that, or, you know, this data isn't exactly right. You've already implanted the story in the beginning.
Well, and you're giving them a lens so that they're all, when they see the data, again, they're not looking at all those actors jumping on and off, but they're looking at the data with a frame and seeing that it makes sense to them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really important too, because, you know, it's important to test the data and make sure that the analysis is solid and stuff like that. But what we would find is, you know, we were focusing on the unimportant actors. That's where the attention was being drawn, and not on the main theme. And so you get distracted and, you know, down these rabbit holes that don't even matter. And so if you give that lens up front, now we're focusing on the stuff that matters. Okay, now if you have, you know, some concerns about the data or the analysis, it's important to talk about, but it's focused.
Yeah, and did you say, I'm curious, somebody had their hand up? We can unmute them if you want.
So that's Michelle, and she also sent her question in the chat box. I just pasted, sorry if it's confusing, I just pasted 3 more questions together that I got privately. But I can go ahead and unmute Michelle and see if she wants to just chat with you guys.
Sure, thank you. Great, thanks. I guess my question was just, with all the data that you have in front of you, how do you choose the story?
Do you want me to take that, Theresa?
Sure, and I can answer later too, but go ahead.
Okay, so we let the analysis tell us where to go and what the story is. It's, you know, the hard part was packaging it in a story format. So we let the data take it where it needs to go. But what we usually try to do with our data is to think up front, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What are we trying to accomplish? So, you know, you can spend hours and hours combing through doing data mining and all of that stuff, come up with little bits of this and that. But if it's not directed towards a business problem, situation, strategy, decision that needs to be made, then it's probably less worth your time than, okay, we need to make a decision about X. Let's let the data tell us what's happening to inform that decision.
And what we try to do is use that model that I showed you earlier, the data dialogue action results. We flip it on its flip it upside down, and we kind of work with the idea of having the results in mind. So a lot of the folks we work with, we ask them to even do a little project where they talk to a manager and try to find out what are the results you need to achieve in the next 6 months. And then from thinking about results, think about the actions that would need to happen. And from that, think about, okay, if these people have to take actions, what are the kind of conversations that are going to compel them? And then you work yourself backwards to the data. And again, when you're in this position of sort of mining data and you're not quite sure, going to results and the results of business needs is really important. I think, Sheri, that just is reflective of what you said also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Was there another question in there, Carrie?
Yeah, so Jennifer asks if you have any advice for how to get started moving in this direction from scratch, for example, no analytics or data team in HR.
Go ahead.
Sheri. Yeah, I was going to say, again, what I'm seeing is, I go back to this results. You know, what's a result a business needs to achieve in the next 6 months? It's important, and you don't have to have really sophisticated data or, you know, no offense, very talented statistical experts. Sometimes the data that you can use is very simple. So, you know, data you already have in your HRS system, or even focus group data, but really trying to think about the data that you can use to help the business drive a result. And then, again, one of the easiest things we do is in trying to think about what's the story, think about what the title of your story is. I mean, a lot of the presentations I see from analytics teams, the title is the analysis they did. So think about the title and choose a picture to frame, and that alone I've seen is very useful from a starting point. And practice with other people. You know, Sheri mentioned working with their HR generalists. We talk about data people and dialogue people. So I don't know which you are, but make sure you team up with somebody else. So even if you're a storyteller, team up with somebody who's a data person. It might be somebody in marketing who can help you. Sheri, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, you know, that's great advice, and I love the point that you made about, you know, when you've got a chart. So one of the things that we ran into early on is that our HR business partners would come to us and say, oh, you know, I'd like to see a demographic analysis of our workforce. And so we would, you know, do some of the charts, but instead of packaging it as a story, we would give them, you know, the results, and then they would just show the charts. And so as an HR business partner, one of the things that you can do is to don't just show the chart before you've had a chance to sit back and say, okay, if I'm the leader looking at this, how would I use this? What would I do? What is the story this data is telling me? And then use that as a starting point and go in not just with the chart, but with some initial thoughts.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Because I have one for you, Sheri, if no one else does.
The only other one I have is from Barbara, and she says, before you get to storytelling, any advice for HR leaders who tend to gravitate towards collecting lots and lots of data but do not have a strategy up front for the why or what they are going to do with it?
Well, my advice is just be a broken record and keep saying, okay, so what is the objective here? What is the decision that you're trying to make? What is the strategy that you're trying to develop that this analysis will help inform? Because otherwise you can just drive yourself crazy doing all this data mining, but it needs to be purposeful. So that's what I just am a broken record. What are you trying to do? Why do you want this analysis? How do you envision this helping you?
Yeah. And my last question, Sheri, was just based on everything you've done and your journey, what one piece of advice would you have for everybody on the phone call?
I would just say just keep on going. Just continuous improvement, and understand that it is very hard to go from data to story. It is not as simple as you would think it would be. So you may have to iterate 4 or 5 times to get to a story, and that's okay. Don't get discouraged by that or frustrated. You may have to and go test out your story with people who aren't familiar with your data or the situation and see if it makes sense, and then modify. So plan that in. If you've got an HRM that's coming up and you need to present results of analysis, give yourself time to iterate on the story.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, because this isn't something, I mean, we've had, again, 2.5 days of people going through it, and, you know, and at the end we say this is about learning a new skill, but you have to practice it. And so practicing is important, and also tell stories about your successes, Because one of the things that I've seen in HR, like really good storytellers, they write down their stories, they remember them, and that's something we don't do very well. So if you have a success, like the story you just told, Sheri, you know, make sure that's part of what your team's knowledge base is, because we all tend to tell the stories about when it didn't work, but if we can start sharing stories about when it did work, and then people will learn from that, it's a great way to just keep the momentum going. But it's about practice, practice, and share your successes.
Great. Well, thank you, Theresa and Sheri. With that, we are at the hour, and I will wrap us up. Again, thanks to the group on the line for some great questions and engaging in the conversation with Theresa and Sheri. And Theresa and Sheri, thank you so much for joining us on the call. We really, really appreciate your insight and expertise, and we look forward to hearing what's next. Everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.